we say get it out of the way, and then we deal with our own affairs in a much more elaborate way. But this is typical of the Ari. Is there is no such thing as one pasuk that's less relevant than another pasuk. Every pasuk is not just the word of God; it's God talking about God. And this is a classic example. Psukim that would seem like, oh, whatever, we have put it in there for whatever reason, we should know a little bit about the world, becomes the whole teaching about what is happening in this world of Tohu. So the third difference is, it doesn't say that he died. So since we're learning it to teach us about the world of Tohu, we're saying the last king of the world of Tohu doesn't have the same level of death as all the earlier kings.
The Rambam actually brings down this actual pasuk. He says the same pasuk that says Ani Hashem Elokechem has the same holiness as the kings, as
of the children of Yishmael and
Esau.
Yeah.
The Rambam says that?
Yep. Shah. It's the same holiness.
Yeah. You need the Zohar and the Ari to teach you why that is. That's like on a level of belief. It's all God gave it all, but this is God talking about God. And talking about you, because we're all part of this, because we're part of that picture. So he says, V'shem Ishto, the name of his wife is Mahat Ve'el. All of these words, not every one of them, but many of these words are going to be analyzed in great detail later on. The name of his wife was Mahat Ve'el, Bas Matred, Bas Mezahav. Okay, very interesting name. Not only does it say her name, it gives her whole lineage for like 3 generations. Wow, what's going on here, right? So, based on this series of deaths, the Ari says that in the world of Tohu is the world of kings that reign and die. One reigns at a time. They're not able to allow anybody else to reign. Let's talk about that for a minute. This is probably what most people know about the world of Tohu. Let's start with Chesed. We could really start with Das, but we'll start with Chesed. Chesed, the sphere of Chesed is the willingness to be kind and to give. If you contrast that with the sphere of Gvura, which the tendency of Gvura is to conceal and to judge and to withhold, they're two separate and totally opposing tendencies. Now the truth is, what is it that allows, you mind maybe closing the door as they're having another shear downstairs. So the Kol Torah, it's nice to have sounds of Torah coming up. But, we don't want to disturb them either. So the question is, sometimes you'll find, and this is based on the teaching of Reb Shalom Ber of Lubavitch in Tafresh Ayin Beis. He says, we find sometimes 2 homeless people. And politically, one is a Democrat and one is a Republican. One is a hippie, the other one is a down-and-out veteran, who hated the hippies back in the day. Yet we find that they bond. Their commonality, or their lack of funds, allows them to overcome their really different worldviews. He says, I'll tell you, he says, what it is. He says, the fact is there are 2 people that we're talking about that don't have very big egos. Probably weren't that driven to begin with. Had they been very driven, they would have lived in bigger homes, not on the street. So the chances are they, to begin with, were humble people, a little too humble. Actually, we're learning in the works of Rav Nachman the dangers of being overly humble. Some of us need to learn that, and I'm glad to say that Aryeh Kaplan also has, he gives a lot of warnings about don't be too humble for people who are already getting kicked around. You need to have a certain kind of existence. So these people didn't have the big ego, so they ended up losing their job, not stepping up for them, not being able to necessarily take what was needed for them to succeed. It's just that makes it easier for them to get along with people who are different than them. But let's say you talk about people who are, each one of them sees themselves as God's gift to mankind. What we would call a king. All of a sudden, a king, there's very little room if the person hasn't developed their sense of leadership, but just knows that they're special and thinks that there's nobody quite like them. It becomes really hard for them to get along with anybody else, because there is no end to their opinion about themselves or how they think of what should be done and how it should be done, because they think it's basically the only way. Since there's nobody as gifted as they are, there's nobody as brilliant as they are, there's nobody as talented as they are, so there could be nobody else who can possibly come up with the equivalent of what they've come up with. So a person with that attitude, even someone who shares a lot in common with them, they'll always butt heads, especially if that other person is also likewise thinking of themselves in terms of being special and super. So that's the reason why there's the Misa. The first reason why we have to understand why there's death is because that they're malachim, they're kings. The death is coming out of the fact that each one of them thinks that I am the king. And they haven't yet developed a sense of how chesed and gvura, how two opposing midot, two opposing tendencies, can find some level of commonality. A vessel that could contain the two opposing elements so that they could share with each other. So we're reading that now into this verse of the death of these kings. And this is a good transition to talk about the world in Nikudim without necessarily having to refer to the psukim, to the verses, which we can always get back to. There's a number of frameworks that we have to understand. I think we covered a few of the verses, enough for you to understand that there's a framework that's putting it into the Torah. Believe me, there's a lot more to do, and that's the beauty of it, that there's so much of it. But I'm giving you just a little taste of seeing how you could read into the psukim. Again, it is a stretch. Nobody's saying that it's the pshat. Even the Ari is not saying this is the pshat. That's why we have a tradition of pardes, pshat, remez, drush, sod, of different levels of understanding and interpreting, and then finally meditating and having a revelation based on a pasuk that's not necessarily what its literal meaning is, and quite different from its literal meaning, but yet as true, and as I said before, maybe even more true, for some at least. But there are other constructs to understand the world of the Nikudim. I mentioned before the concept of Nasa Adam, V'tzalmenu K'dmusenu. The idea of creating God, that God created humanity in His image, creates for us a whole new context, which is to understand the Seder Hishtalshlut, to understand the spiritual coming forth, the chain of beingness that came from being, meaning something that we couldn't understand, something that was beyond our comprehension, how that emanates in a way that's similar to what will become eventually the structure of the human body. So that's why we learned in the world of Akudim the concept of the names of God correlating to the parts of the face. So there, for example, we had the Ab Sag Man Ban, the four names of God, which is a big part of all of these worlds, are understanding the names of God. And they're all based on the name Yud Ke Vav Ke, the four-letter name referred to as a tetragrammaton, the Yud, depending on how you spell out Yud, right? Because you could spell Yud, Vav, Dalet. Hey is Hey, right? Well, the Yud is Yud, Vav, Dalet, but the Hey could be spelled Hey, or
Hey, Yud.
Hey Aleph. Vav is Vav, Aleph Vav, or Vav Vav. So depending on how you spell out the letters, you have these three numerical. You spell out each letter. Depending on how you spell it, you have 63. I'm sorry. Ab is 72, and that relates to Keter usually. Sag 63, and to the eyes. Sag 63, and to the Yud is and to the Yud. Sag is related to the first Hey, and to Chachma, and to the ears. Except it's going to be a little bit reconfigured, as we'll see for the world of Nikudim. And Ma is the Vav. Ma is 45, and that corresponds to the nostrils, and to Bina, and Ban, 52, which is the final Hey, corresponds to the mouth, and to the lower seven, Chesed through Malchut. Now, the configuration I just told you, you might learn somewhere a little bit different, because there's actually a few ways to configure it. I did it Keter, Chachma, Bina, and the seven lower ones. But some people reconfigure that differently. So, if you see it differently, don't say the rabbi was wrong. I'm acknowledging there are different ways of configuring it, that the Ari himself changes a number of times to suit the means of what he's trying to do. With that in mind, he also starts changing things around here in terms of the place of that's the original configuration of what we've done until now, which is in the world of Akudim. But now things are going to start changing. Why? Because Akudim is the first is still kind of fitting in to the world of Adam